I'm Steve Huefner. I'm the Deputy Director of the Election Law Program here at the Moritz College of Law. And today, I'm thrilled to be able to be sharing the stage with Ned Foley, who is the Ebersol Chair in Constitutional Law here at the Moritz College of Law and the Director of our Election Law Program and one of the country's leading experts in the field of election law.
As is Steve.
Well,
He's too modest to say it, but
we have a robust election law program here that's really been a satisfying part of our intellectual lives, our academic careers. Ned spent most of last year in a fellowship at Princeton University, and then over the summer was a visiting fellow in Australia at the University of Melbourne, where he delivered a public lecture. End of July, as I recall, was the date of that lecture. Among other things that he's been doing recently, and he's been spending a lot of time thinking about our electoral system, election institutions, structures, and so forth. And as you know from the announcement of this event, we're here to hear a little bit from Ned about the ways in which American democracy might be in peril at the moment. And this is something that grows out of a lot of what Ned has been doing in recent years, including the lecture he delivered in Australia, and then some additional reflection on some of those topics that he has written about. Ned has a Substack column called Common Ground Democracy, where you can see a lot of important ideas that come out of reflection about where we are in this current moment. We're going to engage in a kind of fireside chat style conversation, the two of us for a bit, and then later in our hour together we'll have an opportunity for some interaction with all of you as well in a question and answer format. I wanted to start by just so the title of our event, of course, has in it the phrase American democracy, and I think we'll want to talk about what that phrase might connote. As a bit of a precursor to that, Ned, I thought I'd ask you to just tell us a little bit about whether there were things from your time in Australia that gave you additional insight into what's happening in American democracy today, to the extent there were lessons to be learned from your time in Australia about our system.
yeah, sure. Thanks to all of you for coming. I do want to say what I was just sort of interjecting before. I've been blessed to have a partnership with Steve over the last 20 years or so in terms of working on democracy issues and election law issues, and it's just so wonderful to be able to engage in collaborative activities like a conversation like today. So thanks to you for helping organize this. So Australia, there's no perfect democracy on the planet. It's not that I'm aware of, and Australia is far from a perfect democracy, but they are in much better shape than we are. And so that invites some comparisons as to why. And happy to talk about those. I think on a podcast we did a month or so ago, I think we talked about compulsory voting as a feature of Australia politics that's distinctive, that would be hard to implement in America, but I do think it's an advantage. So that's something that we could pursue in Q&A or back and forth if that's useful. I think another feature of that's a difference, which again is something that's going to be impossible to change, but the fact that Australia is a parliamentary system, a parliamentary democracy, and not a presidential system, I think makes a huge difference. The stakes of elections and the way in which one thinks about the relationship of voters to their government is very different when all you're doing is electing the legislature and then the legislature elects the prime minister versus where we elect the president and as well as electing a Congress. And of course, we have our bizarre electoral college system, which complicates our presidential elections, and which is going to cause difficulties for us in the 21st century. So if I had to say one thing as to that I would say is that why Australia is in better shape than we are is that they don't have the extra stresses of worrying about a chief executive of the government that just made it too powerful for democracy at all.
So I'm going to want to come back to that, but I'm going to put a pin in it. I think there are arguments to be made that having a presidential system, at least in theory, provides a kind of checking role that's not there with the parliamentary and the prime minister. But let's come back to that, because I think we ought to put on the table or foundation here a little bit more about what we mean by American.
But I don't think it was always true for the United States that having a separately elected president was sort of as much of a stress on having a fair elections and having a democracy. Now, I think for complicated historical reasons, the office of the presidency has just become incredibly transformed in the aftermath of World War II. And so I think it's the modern American presidency that no other country, even other presidential systems, don't have. The office of the American presidency is a uniquely powerful office on the world stage. And I think that poses challenges for us that our country never had previously and no other country has as well.
Well, so we may come back to that a little bit, but I know that we have said in the publicity about this event that to understand the risks facing American democracy today, you'd like us to understand what we mean by American democracy in terms of two significant historical periods and the way in which democracy as practiced in the United States has changed or evolved. So could I ask you to just describe a little bit more about, and this does relate to the post-World War II era you were mentioning with respect to presidential power, but tell us a little bit more about what we need to understand by the phrase American democracy.
Yeah, no, I think this is really maybe the most important point to try to appreciate why American democracy seems to be in such stress at the moment. Again, there are global factors. I mean, other countries, France, Germany, I mean, there are a lot of democracies around the world that are struggling, that have different characteristics than our own democracy. But there are others, like Australia, that are doing better, and so we have to try to figure out what is affecting each country that's causing it to have problems or stresses or relative degrees of difficulty. But something that I think is definitely true about American democracy that is causing us stress right now is it's a combination of these two different periods of American history. The first period is the founding, and I'll come back to that in a second, but the second period, and I think what we colloquially and sort of take for granted as American democracy is really a product of the post-World War II era, and the fact that, after defeating Hitler for the sake of democracy, we as a country had to kind of live up to our own values and practice what we preached. And so we went through the civil rights era to correct, fundamental flaws in American democracy, and that led to the 1960s, where in addition to getting civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation out of Congress, the U.S. Supreme Court interpreted the Constitution, particularly the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, to require doctrines like one person, one vote, the concept of equal voting rights. And so the notion of our sense that democracy requires all of us to have equal rights of participation in our political system, that's not a notion that existed at the time of the founding, quite obviously. The ability to to vote was unbelievably restricted at the founding. Women couldn't vote. Slavery existed, as you all know. You had to own property, even if you were a white male, to vote at the time of the founding. And so I think it's wrong to say that they didn't have any conception of democracy at all. They probably would have called it a Republican form of government because they didn't want a monarchy, they didn't want an aristocracy as they understood that. So they wanted a Republican form of government that allowed for some voting rights and some notion of popular sovereignty, but it's just not the understanding of popular sovereignty that we Americans have inherited from the civil rights era and from the post-World War II era in the 1960s. But we didn't replace the old with the new. Instead, the old and the new are sitting side by side in considerable tension. So there are all these features of the original Constitution, including the Electoral College as our method for electing presidents, which were adopted in an era with an entirely different philosophy of democracy, if you will, and we have a difficult procedure for constitutional amendments, and we haven't replaced the old Constitution, and so the moment that we're in right now is causing us to kind of lose, or I don't know about lose, but there's stresses being put on our post-World War II modern conception of democracy that our old Constitution can't really help us preserve because the old Constitution just is not in sync with the changes that were created in the 1960s, but the changes that were created in the 1960s are not as durable because they don't have the status within our legal system that the founding document. So until we kind of figure out how to come to grips with this tension between the old and the new, our democracy is going to be fragile and in some degree of peril that's, I think, inevitable.
So you talked about both the role that Congress played and the role that the court played briefly in terms of this dramatic restructuring of what democracy is in America, back especially in the 1960s. Most of us in the room didn't live through that, at least in a way that our memory permits us to access. And it's really interesting to think about how the democracy that we have all kind of grown up with is so different from the way in which American democracy was structured at the founding. Is there a role, or was there a role that the presidency played in that dramatic restructuring? We talked about Congress, the Voting Rights Act, and the court with things like the one person, one vote cases in the 60s. What's the role of the third branch?
Well, I think, in their own way, President Eisenhower in the 1960s and Presidents Kennedy and Johnson in the 1960s were supportive of moves that the U.S. Supreme Court was making to try to improve American democracy. And so, maybe a little bit of oversimplification, but broadly speaking, you did have all three branches of the federal government in sync in buying into this conception. That was really important. There was a very strong sense of shared identity after World War II. Because World War II was so monumental an event, and it affected all walks of life, from the richest to the least affluent, and universal male conscription into the military meant that people from all parts of the country and all walks of life were serving together. I mean, there's a reason why they call it the greatest generation, and America came back from the war with a sense of social solidarity as a country and wanted to improve itself as a country. And I don't want to be completely Pollyannish about it. The civil rights era had its conflicts, and there were people who, in the South, who were really fighting immigration. But but nonetheless, you had more social capital in the United States for a shared enterprise, and certainly at the level of the federal government, that meant that you weren't having a presidency in opposition to the court and in opposition to Congress in terms of trying to implement this new, truly egalitarian and inclusive vision of modern democracy.
And you have written, including in your Common Ground Substack, about the idea of there being a golden age of American democracy at that era, in a sense. And this notion that it was something that the entire country was coming together behind and embracing, I think can be seen in things like the way in which the Department of Justice at the national level and the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare and its Civil Rights Division was implementing policies to try it and effectuate this broad conception of democracy. Now, of course, there's the...
Can I say one more thing about it?
Please,
And political scientists have taught us that basically after World War II, up until the 1980s, that was the period of lowest partisan polarization in American politics. So again, even though there was conflict in the 60s, and there was race riots and violence and stuff like that, the dynamic of the democratic process and the relationship of electoral politics and partisan contestation was very different than what it is today. And you also had much less wealth inequality, partly because of the taxes that were necessary to sustain World War II, meant that certain kinds of things that could cause pressure on a democratic system were at the relatively low ebb. And so even though there was conflict at the time, the fact that it wasn't partisan polarization didn't put as much strains on our political system as when you have conflict and the degree of hyper-partisan polarization that we have now. It is a different kind of strain on our system than what it used to. And that allowed us, so for example, Watergate was a huge shock on the system in the early 1970s, but we had the capacity as a nation coming out of World War II, coming out of the 50s and the 60s to handle something like Watergate, that we just don't have the cultural capital and the reservoir of a sense of social solidarity that we had back then.
Okay, so that's a segue to really getting into the meat of our topic for today, which is to invite you to share now what it is about our current institutional structure as well as our current political culture that is creating such risk.
Yeah, so this is where it's important again to understand that our current environment is shaped both by the founding moment and the heritage that we have from the original Constitution, plus our attempt in the second half of the 20th century to build a new kind of society without replacing the old Constitution. The most important feature for understanding where we are today about the original Constitution was this idea. Sometimes we use the phrase Madisonian democracy because James Madison was the principal architect of the Constitution. He didn't do it alone. He was one member of the Constitutional Convention, but he was an intellectual leader with a philosophical vision of what the new American system of government should look like. And it was built on a notion of separation of powers, which is why we have a presidency as well as the Congress and the judiciary. And the basic fundamental Madisonian idea, which many of you may have learned about in high school or college with the Federalist Papers and so forth, the way I like to think about it is the job of the Constitution is to create institutional structures that will work well and work for the sake of the public as a whole, the community as a whole, given the degree of civic virtue that exists in society. Madison and the other founders knew that humans weren't perfect. And they said in the Federalist Papers, if humans were, I'm paraphrasing here, but if humans were perfect, you wouldn't need a government in the first place. But if there wasn't sufficient civic virtue, you couldn't have a Republican form of government. In other words, if there's just complete corruption, complete venality within society, total dog-eat-dog kind of attitude, that's going to lead to the, if you think philosophically, Thomas Hobbes, you'll need to have despotism just to constrain the inherent amount of violence that's going to, because it's a war of all against all. So the Madisonian idea is we have to match our set of institutions to our civic culture. And if you do that well, then you'll be in a kind of Madisonian equilibrium where the institutions match the repository of goodwill and civic virtue that exists in society. And that was a nice idea. Of course, in some ways it didn't work from the get-go. And of course we had a civil war. So the Madisonian system kind of failed in the 19th century, and I think we sometimes over-glorify the founding moment. There was a lot of important aspects to it, including, I think, this idea about relating institutions to civic culture is really a key insight. But my own contention is we really didn't have a good Madisonian equilibrium in America until after World War II. I mean, in other words, and the way in which we created a new equilibrium obviously involved this much more broader, inclusive vision of democracy than Madison and his compatriots ever had. But the problem is now we're in a situation of disequilibrium. There have been changes in our society that have caused the institutions that we have. I mean, we have essentially the same electoral institutions and political institutions that we had in the aftermath of World War II and in the 50s, 60s, up until today. It's not that we've done fundamental structural change of a great scale. We still have the presidency, we still have the electoral college, et cetera, et cetera. But again, in that post-war environment, we had, we replenished our well of civic virtue, the greatest generation did. But then, starting in the 70s and 80s, income inequality started to grow after the oil shocks of the 1970s and changes to our income tax structure. And so it's just harder and harder to have social solidarity as the gap between the haves and the have-nots grow. Globalization, I mean, again, these are not necessarily the faults of any nefarious person, but the changes in technology and the globalization of the world economy has put incredible pressures on society. I do think social media is a huge factor, and the way, I mean, I'm sure you've all heard about the cliche that back in the 1960s we all watched I mean, I was alive then, but not a lot of you were, but people watched Walter Cronkite and trusted Walter Cronkite to tell you about the Vietnam War. There isn't any shared sense of watching the same TV show every night that happened back then. I mean, there were 3 networks, not just Walter Cronkite on CBS, but the general point is fragmentation of the media, and we're in this unfortunate vicious circle where economic challenges from globalization, from increasing wealth inequality, combined with media fragmentation, has just created a downward spiral such that our reservoir of civic virtue is not as high as it was 50 years ago or so. And so now these same institutions are not well matched for the society in which they exist. And so we're in a Madisonian disequilibrium. So you can get back to equilibrium in one of 2 ways. You can solve the lack of civic virtue problem to get back to equilibrium, or you need institutional change. I mean, it would be great if we could just magically create civic virtue. my judgment is that's hard to do. And we're not going to get rid of social media. Globalization is going to be hard to undo. You can try a tariff policy to try to combat the effects of globalization. I'm not sure how successful that's going to be. I'm not an economist, but and so I think we actually need to think about tinkering and tweaking our political institutions as the way to get back to a Madisonian equilibrium.
So I hear you saying that in what we might call the golden age of American democracy, if you will, in the 1960s, 1970s, that there was rough equilibrium between our institutions and our political culture, our civic virtue. That the institutions have stayed relatively static, but we've lost civic virtue. Now, as you say, there are two ways to get back in equilibrium, but before we explore a little bit more about what we might do to restore some equilibrium, can I ask you to tell us a little bit more about the specifics you see that, the specific damage, risk, problems that we are experiencing because of that disequilibrium? What is it that the relative shift in civic virtue has meant that our institutions no longer permit to happen well?
Yeah, so let's take the Electoral College just as an example of a static institution, but it didn't really cause us any problems. The Electoral College, while still not a very good institution, did not cause problems in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, or whatever. The first new serious problem the Electoral College caused was in 2000, which, there was, the 2000 presidential election was complicated because you may have heard of these hanging chads and the Supreme Court cases versus Ford, and all of that, and that was problematic, but that only happened because the Electoral College meant that there was a disconnect between, the philosophical vision of the 1960s, in other words, this idea of the new democracy that motivated the Warren Court to create the doctrine of one person, one vote. That philosophy is diametrically opposite to the philosophy of the Electoral College. And in fact, in the 1960s, there was the attempt to get rid of the Electoral College that came closest to being successful, but it couldn't get the 2/3 vote in both the Senate and the House of Representatives to send an amendment to the states to get rid of the Electoral College. And that's just because of how difficult constitutional amendments are. This was sort of 1968, 1969. The Gallup Public Opinion polling firm polled the American attitude about, do you like the Electoral College, or would you rather replace it with a national popular vote where everybody has equal voting rights and just elect the president that way? Back in the 1960s, 80% of Americans wanted to get rid of the Electoral College. 80%, right? And yet it couldn't, the political system was too sclerotic to allow that incredibly strong preference on the part of the people to have their way. And the mechanisms of the old Constitution defeated the will. So what that happens is you have an election in 2000 that if it had been conducted according to the vision of democracy that people wanted post-1960 and the Supreme Court had embraced in its one person, one vote idea. In other words, if you ran the 2000 election according to that philosophy, you would have had a different, you wouldn't have had any problems with hanging chads. You wouldn't be fighting over 537 vote margins with Florida. Right? And there would have just been a clear winner. And the problem that the contestation over the hanging chads in Florida in 2000 did was it didn't just affect that election. Because of increased polarization by that time, and because of a vicious circle, we have started, another election law scholar called Rick Hassan wrote a book called The Voting Wars, the voting wars, in other words, fighting over the rules of our electoral system for partisan advantage, was a lesson learned by fighting over the outcome of Bush versus Gore. And so the defect of the Electoral College triggered a cancer within the American body politic that wouldn't, or it infected us with a disease that we didn't have, and we wouldn't have been infected with that particular disease but for the institutional problem, the Electoral College, which didn't cause a problem in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
But isn't there an argument there that it's not that civic virtue has diminished, or at least as of 2020, I said as of 2000, but just that the institution was not up to the task of what was being presented for the system to address?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I mean, some of them, my analysis, relies on a little bit of speculation or judgment or conjecture, and we can't, run the clock a different way. But, if the type of close, in other words, if the fight over Bush versus Gore had occurred back in the 1970s, obviously, the political contestation over Watergate was different than the political contestation over the hanging chads. But by 2000, we had already started the descent. The descent started in the 1990s. And I'm trying to be nonpartisan. And I want democracy to work for everybody. I don't care what political party you're a member of or want to be a member of, and whether you want high taxes or low taxes or environmental policies. I mean, we have to deliberate about the social policies that govern our country from a democratic standpoint. That's the perspective that I come in. And so, but most historians of this period that I've read, talk about the culture of Congress changed with the rise of Newt Gingrich. And there was an attempt to polarize politics that started in the 1990s and has been accelerated since then. And so a fight over hanging chads might have been quite different in 1972, 1973. Although of course you can't think about it that way because the Nixon-Montgomery race was a landslide, but there was, but I don't know that the country would have tolerated the contestation over the hanging chads in quite the way the country did by 2000 relative to the 1970s, but that is conjecture.
Any other specifics that you'd like to share about the way in which this disconnect between the institutions we have and the political culture we have is creating existential risk in the way in which a lot of people are talking these days?
I mean, I think there's two more examples from the electoral. I mean, I have problems with other aspects of the electoral system than just the presidential electoral college thing, and I think the way in which we do Senate elections has caused the U.S. Senate not to perform the Madisonian function that it's supposed to of checking abusive powers of the presidency. So, we could focus on the failure of the Senate to perform its proper constitutional role, which I think is a really serious problem right now. But we wouldn't even be putting the pressure on the Senate if we hadn't had other electoral college problems. So we already had a huge electoral college problem in 2000, which whatever you think about the status of civic culture pre-2000, Newt Gingrich, all that point, the voting wars post-2000 have exacerbated the problem in a huge way, and combined with the aggressiveness of partisan gerrymandering has just coarsened our culture. Then 2016 comes along, and we have another failure of the Electoral College to match the modern conception of democracy. And so that gives us a presidency which is probably, I mean, again, it's not a partisan point, it's just that if the philosophy of democracy that motivated the 1960s would have had an institution that would not have caused the 2016 outcome. But the 2016 outcome is the outcome that it is. And then you have the 2020 election. And what's the most dominant fact of the 2020 election? It's then President Trump claimed that the election was stolen from him because he looked at, and he brought lawsuits in 7 states saying that he won Georgia, and he won Pennsylvania, he won Michigan. That's an electoral college problem. Right? If you had a national popular vote in 2020, and didn't have an electoral college problem, you couldn't be complaining about Pennsylvania and Georgia. And the Biden victory was 7 million votes. You wouldn't, the discourse around the outcome, there would have been no insurrection on January 6th if there hadn't been an electoral college in the first place. There wouldn't have been a belief in the big lie if there had been an electoral college. And the sense of, there wouldn't have been, 4 criminal trials against President Trump. All of the ugliness of American politics, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. It's all metastasized. But that metastasizing process wouldn't have happened but for this institutional defect at the get-go.
But I know that when you think of the risks to American democracy, and we're going to open it up for questions here in just a minute, but when you think of the risks to American democracy, I know you're thinking not just of electoral college problems. You're thinking, and not just about presidential roles, right? So
it's a lot of, it's gerrymandering, and it's a panoply of things, right? The political culture is the reason why we wrote a book together from registration to recounts was our recognition that there's electoral ecosystems are, the totality of an ecosystem is more than just looking at the individual pieces of the ecosystem. And our current national electoral ecosystem has lots of different problems. And I've been focusing just on one piece, but there are multiple pieces for sure.
well, in our conversation so far this afternoon, you've been focusing heavily on the electoral college and its disconnect with this 1960s era conception of democracy. But I know another part of your work, recent work, has been focused on the way in which political parties have distorted candidates and the election choices that we as citizens have across all kinds of races at the state and local level. And that was part of your lecture in Australia as well. And we don't have time today to go through all of the work you've done on the primary problem, if you want to call it that, the problem of partisan primaries and how they are distorting what it is that we experience as democratic elections today. But
we won't go into all the details, but so here's an institutional arrangement that we've had, for a long time, partisan primaries, where, the parties nominate the candidates for the general elections through primary elections, and then you go on the ballot in general elections, you have what we call plurality winner general elections, which means whoever gets the most votes in the general election wins. It doesn't have to be a majority, it just has to be more than anybody else. And the mathematics of a plurality winner system combined with partisan primaries causes problems in situations of acute polarization that don't surface when polarization is not acute. So same institutions in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s work okay, but as partisan polarization gets worse and worse and worse from the 1990s to the 2000s to the 2010s, suddenly this institution that's been around for a while, the partisan primaries, starts to be an absolute disaster for American democracy. And that's not gerrymandering, and it's not the Electoral College, and that's why the Senate has failed. The Senate is not a gerrymandered institution, but the Senate is not able to perform its current, or its constitutional function under current polarization conditions because of the electoral institutions of how we elect our senators, and the problem there, and so there, the primary problem is indeed the primary problem.
So let me invite some interaction now. We've had a robust discussion so far, and I'm sure we will continue to talk about important, interesting things. And we have a microphone that just our election law program director will pass around.
Hi, I was wondering, with the, just like political campaigns and like the donations that go into political campaigns, I was wondering what are your thoughts on like how much money is spent in today's political campaigns and how that relates to the downfalls of our American democracy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do think changes in our campaign finance practices are some of the factors that are causing the decline of civic virtue and social solidarity and all of that. Some of that is technologies, but some of it is the court's Citizens United decision and the Buckley versus Vallejo decision before that. Campaign finance is a complicated and important topic that we both cover in our election law classes, so I don't think it's all of the problem, and I don't think simply undoing Citizens United and Buckley versus Vallejo is being a magic solution that would suddenly solve all of the problems. But there's pretty good data, and this is covered in the chapter of a different book that I've worked on recently with a couple of other scholars from other universities as part of a larger task force. That we have actually, our election law program housed here and where's Ishri? She's responsible for the management of this task force that we had to produce a book that has a chapter on campaign finance, and that chapter talks about how small dollar donations tend to be more polarizing. And we've, through the combination of the internet technology and the Citizens United campaign Supreme Court decision, we've allowed for these small dollar donations to force candidates to cater to more extreme views, thereby polarizing politics. So I do think the money in politics is a definite piece of the problem.
To me, it's an interesting example of the way in which institutions and culture are so tightly related. There are plenty of robust democracies in other countries that protect individual rights and free speech and have robust elections on a regular basis that have a very different approach to campaign finance, without any sense in those countries that the speech rights of individual citizens or candidates are being restricted. But we couldn't just change our institutional structure, our legal structure. We couldn't just wave our magic wand and reverse the Buckley decision or the Citizens United decision, because our culture wouldn't tolerate it today, I don't think. So it's a...
And to your point, and this is getting a little wonky, but the role of polarizing campaign donations has an extra effect in partisan primaries. And so what it does is it forces partisan primaries to tend to choose candidates who are more extreme within their own party. And therefore, the combination of our campaign finance problems and the way in which we structure primary elections is a double negative. It's a multiplying, it's a negative multiplying effect. And so to undo that problem, it would be actually easier to change the way we do primary elections than it would be the way we do to change campaign finance. So figuring out the right medicine for the disease. The disease may be caused by two things, but one, it may be easier to remedy one cause rather than the other cause.
Howdy. I saw Bob Woodward talk at OU not too long ago, and he talked about Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon, and used sort of similar language about the, the well of civic virtue. And then you have a case like Bush v. Gore where, Al Gore maybe a little bit preemptively drops out to sort of, again, try and protect this sort of well of civic virtue, right? Are these foolish attempts? In retrospect, we can see they didn't work, but like at the time, is it a ridiculous thing to try? And is it a ridiculous thing to try now? Thanks.
Well, no, I don't think it was a ridiculous thing to, Ford's pardon of Nixon was controversial, but it was an effort at civic healing and may have been beneficial for that reason. The Gore story is interesting because he did concede the election on election night and then retracted his concession, and that's an interesting, complicated story.
And then conceded graciously once
Yeah,
the
he's right.
Supreme Court.
Yes. And that was a very gracious speech that he gave 35 days later or whatever.
But that's looked to, that 35-day later speech is looked to as a moment of healing, saying, these are the institutions we have, including the court role here, and I'm not going to continue to fight this in Congress. There was a realpolitik level here too, that he realized he couldn't really win out, but...
Again, I think it was a nice attempt. I think, unfortunately, the operative elements of a political party, the lesson that they learned was fight harder, not to succeed more quickly or graciously. So how do we...
But was it the right thing for purposes of maintaining this well of civic virtue to not have fought harder to get to the question?
Yeah, but I'm also hearing, what do we do now? And I think that's a very difficult question, unfortunately, because I think, with each cycle, we sort of are in worse places. I don't want to relive mistakes that I think that occurred after the 2020 election and the big lie and the insurrection, as awful as they were. I think, unfortunately, when the Democratic Party came in power in 2021, they acted too aggressively and didn't try to find enough common ground to isolate the authoritarian tendencies within our political system. And
Squandered an opportunity.
Yeah, which makes it even more difficult now. But how can we learn that lesson? How do we rebuild? We have to, what we absolutely have to have, and I hope it's not a naive, idealist thing, we have to have a sense that the opposition party are not our enemies, right? That we have to, that's why I call the subset common ground democracy. We've got to realize that our sincere policy differences are things that we debate about and vote about from a position of mutual respect and sense of civic solidarity. Otherwise, you can't have a democracy. If the goal is to obliterate your opponent, it's not a sustainable thing. And unfortunately, I think the psychological dynamic is to obliterate the opponent.
Haven't we weathered other eras when that was the goal? Think about Alien and Sedition Acts to go way back.
Yeah, we came close to our first civil war over the election of 1800, and thankfully we didn't. The militias were mobilized in case.
Not that we should, press our luck here, but we have weathered real challenges.
Yeah, but we didn't weather the challenge of the 1850s. Again, I'm not predicting this a new civil war, but I don't think you can sort of automatically assume that we have the capacity to avoid, really acute crisis. So again, 1800 was very close. 1876 was very close. The good news out of 2000 was, again, it's as ugly as 2001. We still have enough. There were not tanks in the streets in 2000. There was not the sense that the stakes were so high that we couldn't walk away from that.
Thank you both for a very interesting discussion. I really like the emphasis on the post-World War II consensus, particularly because it feels like what's happened with the current administration in recent times is that that consensus has broken down around democracy, around our alliance with Western democracies in Europe. But I was wondering if there are other dimensions that are also significant. One, I think our commitment to democracy coming out of World War II was based on our war against fascist totalitarian countries, but it was also based on our framing of the Cold War as they are totalitarian, we are democratic. And so the end of the Cold War in the 1990s also corresponds with this increasing polarization, Newt Gingrich and following. I wonder if that is also a piece of the puzzle. Interested in your thoughts on that. And then when you talk about these kind of moments of constitutional visions of democracy, aren't we skipping over another very important constitutional moment in our history, which is the Civil War amendments? And we did rewrite the Constitution at that point. And so is there another body of constitutional law that we can look to, even if we can't look back to the founding, because they had a very different vision of democracy? Can we maybe look back to the Civil War amendments for a vision of democracy that we could rely on legally at this point? Interested in your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, on the first point, I think it was John Dickerson, if you know that political commentator, broadcaster, who made this point recently in one of his podcasts, but it may have been somebody else who made the point that Newt Gingrich could not have done what he did absent of winning the Cold War. There was social solidarity in fighting the Cold War, and so we didn't need to have that social. So we could fight amongst ourselves once we didn't have to fight against the common enemy. So I think that's a valid point. Again, I said I don't want us to have another world war in order to regain civic solidarity. We got to be able to figure out a way to do this without that. And I think the best historical lesson, it's not perfect, but I think we're living in a neo-Gilded Age right now. The Gilded Age of the 1880s, 1890s. A lot of wealth inequality, a lot of political polarization, and yet we managed. The progressive era was not perfect, but we did transition from the Gilded Age to the progressive era without a world war. So there's hope. Remind me of the
Civil War.
Oh, yeah. So, of course the Civil War amendments are really important, but the sad fact of American history, from my vantage point, is you can call them the Civil War amendments, but they were also supposed to be the Reconstruction amendments, right? Reconstruction was supposed to be a success. And Reconstruction was a failure. In other words, the collapse of Reconstruction meant that, the whole point of the Reconstruction amendments was the promise of civil rights nationwide. And abandoning Reconstruction after the election of 1876 meant that Reconstruction was a hollow promise until the Civil Rights Revolution. So So that's why I would point more to the 1960s and 50s, 60s post-war as generative of the kind of democracies that we want. It didn't really work and take hold, unfortunately, during Reconstruction.
So I know I've seen at least 3 more hands, so we'll see if we can get from each end.
Okay, so my question is about how to move forward in a way, in a way that doesn't require another war or something like that. I'm originally from Chile. In Chile, at the end of the 80s, we had a dictatorship that ended. At the last couple of years, the dictator tied a couple of reforms that were kind of intended to promote political stability and lock it into kind of a two-party system, kind of artificial system. That system for electing Congress changed in 2015. It lasted like 17 or 18 years, and it was changed through constitutional changes. But what I'm thinking there is that the discussion around changing that system was very locked for at least 10 years, until there were a couple of very minimal, if you look back, there were a couple of kind of minimal changes that happened over the course of something like 5 or 6 years that enabled that discussion to get unstuck. That had to do with changes in number of representatives, changes in proportions and quorums, changes in how the government coalition was being formed to promote a little bit of multiple perspectives or proportional perspectives within representing Congress. And so thinking of that, my thought now is, well, what could be those, small changes around the edges that could help us maybe not change the big thing, the big issue, or face the big issue, but to change the balance and get us unstuck, because that's how we feel, or where we feel we are right now.
Yeah, great. So in 2021, I wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post, and then I wrote a law review article. Basically a one-sentence statute that would say, to win a seat in Congress, you have to win by a majority of votes instead of a plurality of votes.
Full stop.
That's it, right? And
Simple law.
and I hope that it would be relatively uncontroversial, because I think most Americans sort of think that elections, are supposed to be based on majority winners. And so I would have hoped that that could have been a non-controversial law, but it would actually have huge positive effects. It didn't happen, again, because unfortunately there was a lost opportunity. Congress got sidetracked in a very ugly partisan way in 21 and 22. So, but these ideas are still on the table, and so if we get through the midterms and have free and fair elections in the midterms according to the current system, meaning everybody who wants to vote gets to vote and the votes are counted accurately, whoever wins gets to sit in Congress, and then we have a free and fair presidential election in 28. And even though it's the Electoral College, and we've got to play by the rules that we have, we may have an opportunity, at the end of this decade to make some of those, relatively small reforms that can have big positive effect. But we're going to be in a crisis mode, unfortunately, I think, between now and 2029, that we have to sort of weather this storm, to use a cliche, and hope to get to the place where we can do some of the rebuilding that needs to be done.
Let's try to take a couple more here, yeah?
Hi, thank you guys both for the conversation. You spoke a little bit about the role of social media and technological shift in the current political moment we're in. I'm curious how much you think that some of the insufficiencies of our current institutional structures has to do with conceits upon when they were being created of the kind of naturally occurring points of friction, geographically and temporally, that existed at the time, that kind of don't exist in the same manner in the world of social media, where everything kind of happens less on like a local scale, more on a national and international universal scale.
Yeah, that reminds me of your work to think about alternative ways of districting, not even using geographic districts, which is contingent on a different era than we live in today, but use.
No, yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, again, that this old constitution that we have is so geography-based. I mean, as difficult it is to amend the Constitution, we're not even allowed by the difficult amendment process to change the rule that each state has 2 senators regardless of population. Right, that you can't take away Wyoming's right to equal number of senators as California without Wyoming's consent under the existing document. Good luck with that, right? Right, and again, the philosophy that led to that was an 18th century philosophy that just does not resonate with 21st century ideals. I mean, we may not completely want to get rid of states, but I think many people think that the imbalance of power between Wyoming and California is not healthy, and yet there's sort of nothing we can do about it. So yeah, it's interesting to think of how we would, redesign a healthy democracy for the next 250 years if we could, do it from a clean slate. I mean, there is some risk. I don't know how you all feel about the idea of a new constitutional convention. People are afraid of what's called a runaway constitutional convention that might, adopt a very authoritarian type constitution. But our old constitution is so brittle and there's so much pressure on it that there's a non-trivial chance of an attempt to just rethink the whole thing from the ground up, and what that would look like, we all would need to brainstorm.
We'll take this question here.
Yeah, so I think I really love, a conversation about change over time. And I think that recognizing the change of the promise of democracy after World War II is an incredibly, articulate argument about how we can understand how the promises of democracy and the nature of liberty changed from the founding to now. I guess, it sounded to me, over the course of the early part of the talk, that maybe the push that we're beating around is that Republican presidential candidates have only won one popular election in now three decades, I think, right? Only 2004. And so, if the system is natural, if Republican candidates in our duality of a system are always going to be advantaged to retain the Electoral College, of which I am not a fan, and it does not sound as if y'all are a fan of, what meaningful steps in the next 8 years can we advocate for that have any real purchase of finding meaningful change if we recognize the exceptional power of the modern American presidency? And I think that we can all sort of acknowledge the ways in which the stakes of every election now are positioned by both parties as existential questions. If changing that system poses an existential threat to Republican presidents ever winning again in the future because of the ways we've seen large-scale population factors as to how people vote and trends over time, what meaningful steps can we as young potential lawyers in the next 5 years advocate for? Because I hear you on the statutory considerations. I would love to see Congress be elected by majority vote rather than plurality. But I can't imagine a world in which that ever passes a non-veto proof bill passage. And I don't necessarily understand a world in which you can find that majority. Certainly not in our climate of polarization.
Well, first of all, just I think we all have to acknowledge that President Trump won the national popular vote in 2024. So yes, prior to that, 2004 was a victory of a Republican candidate with a national popular vote, but Trump won the national popular vote in 2024. But that leads to a conversation that we don't have time for completely today, but one of the things that we have to do is understand exactly what the concept of majority elections are. And some of the work that Steve and I have done over the last few years is to say that the best understanding of majority elections is where you look for the candidate who can beat each opponent head-to-head by a majority vote, which is not a system that we currently have. And if you want to go look on my Substack, I wrote after the 2024 election, the only vote that we got to vote in 2024 was Trump versus Harris. Of course, Biden stayed around for as long as he stayed around and, made it difficult for Harris to run against Trump. But anyway, the only thing on the ballot essentially was Trump versus Harris. There was a huge effort during the 24 campaign to find a middle lane between what was then Trump and Biden. And, Joe Manchin thought about running on the no labels thing, but didn't want to be a spoiler under our current system. Larry Hogan thought about running for president instead of running for the Senate for Maryland, again, as a kind of a moderate, non-Trump Republican to be in the middle lane. Nikki Haley, even running within the Republican primary, was trying to run as an alternative to the two octogenarians, Trump versus Biden. There was this huge effort to find a middle lane that our current political system doesn't allow. It's a bit of conjecture, but it's my view that any of those middle lane candidates would have won in an election that allowed the voters to vote their preference as to each pair among the three of them. So we only got one pair, Trump versus Harris, but you pick your favorite of those middle lane possibilities. Say Nikki Haley, because she actually did run, right? I think Nikki Haley also would have beaten Harris for the same reasons that Trump did, but I think all Americans, not just Republicans in the primary, Nikki Haley would have beaten Trump. Because, remember, Harris was running with Liz Cheney at her side, saying it was essential from her perspective, from their perspective, that Trump not win. So an electoral system that would have allowed all voters in November to vote Nikki Haley versus Trump, as well as Nikki Haley versus Harris, as well as Harris versus Trump, Harris would have run a campaign with Liz Cheney at her side and said, yeah, vote for me first. Actually, Liz Cheney would have said, vote for Nikki Haley first. But Harris would have said, you've got to choose Haley over Trump.
So is the answer ranked choice voting?
It could be ranked choice voting. It doesn't have to be ranked choice voting. It could just be a ballot that says, do you want Trump or Harris? Do you want Trump or Haley? Or do you want Haley versus Harris? Just three head-to-head, right? And you vote all, and whichever candidate beats the other two head-to-head gets elected. And, it's my conjecture, I can't prove this, it's my conjecture if we had that system, Nikki Haley would be president right now. And so we would have had our first woman of color as president. And all of the lesson after 24, which I understand and believe, is saying America can, in fact, I just heard on the news this morning, Michelle Obama saying America can't elect a woman president. I hope that's not true. And I think America was ready to elect a woman president. It just wasn't going to be Kamala Harris, but I think America was ready to elect Nikki Haley, but didn't have that opportunity because of the structure of our electoral system.
So this is a good place to end in terms of inviting everyone to keep thinking about this relationship between institutions and culture. And these are hard questions, and we encourage everybody to remain engaged and thoughtful in seeking more civic virtue and fairness. It's not about one party or the other, it's about institutions and culture that work for the long-term survival and health of our system. So, thank you for joining us today.